All right, so due to special request, I'm going to go ahead and make a video on what it was like buying bus parts in the 80s. And I kind of have to go with a couple other things that are a little bit, were way different than bugs. Bus parts, a lot of them were not available. There's actually more bus parts available now than there was even back in the 80s and early 90s. And I actually was one of the only guys. I only knew a few people that were really into buses, and I wasn't really into them. I just was kind of into them, and I just had one. It was my work truck. So, but I'm going to talk to you guys about what stuff cost then and what it cost. You know, you guys can compare those prices to now. But I have to kind of remember a lot of this stuff you couldn't buy new. So. With that, I'm just going to kind of walk around and show you some of the parts that were available. These here, the window rubber, they only had, there was two suppliers of these. In the early 90s, there was Wolfsburg West, and before that, it was West Coast Metrics. And West Coast Metrics had the rubber for these. They had the rubber for these, but I think these were about $20 a piece, and they were only German rubber. You could not get like a Brazilian copy or Mexican copy or whatever. It was only German stuff. So, and these here were German, only German, and they were about the same price as they are now, about $15 or $15 or $18 for this rubber, and the inside one, about the same price as they are today. A lot of this trim and stuff you could not buy. So if you didn't have it, you'd have to go to what we did is we used to just go to Pick Apart, and friends would tell you, hey, there's a bus at Pick Apart, and you could find them there, and we just go out there and start stripping them. I do remember buying a set just like this style, not the pointed ones. Those came on this bumper. I gotta find some pointed ones now because I got the pointed bumper. But the pointed bumper guards. I don't know if I got that in the video. And the pointed the bumper guards. I remember going to Pick Apart and getting those things, taking them off a good straight rear bumper at Pick Apart, and getting them for I think $10 or something like that. And it wasn't even a pair of them, I think, for $10. And and not even thinking about ever keeping the rest of the bumper. It was just like, oh, who cares, press bumpers were only available used for early buses. You still paid back then. I saw if you got a junked out ratty press bumper, you could find one for maybe $100. Was about the cheapest you could find one for, and the ones that were nicer usually were about $250. So a lot of people think the bus stuff was cheaper back then, but it was actually more expensive. And it's weird that it's amazing that there's actually so many of these things still surviving today, because with the parts prices as high as they were, it's really surprising that people kept them on the road, because you had to really like the bus to be able to restore it and keep it and drive it, or just work on them. A lot of this stuff here, like the rubber around the back, was only available NOS from the dealer. So a lot of that stuff we used to get. I used to go to the dealer, and you could go there if you knew the part number of the part. You could go to the dealer, and you just give them the part number, and they'd look it up, and they'd find out if they had it, and then they go, oh yeah, that's available at so and so store, and then they'd order it. It was done like manually. There was computers, but not really. They were crappy old things, and they would check and see if they had the part somewhere, and they would get it and order it, and it would come in. Usually it was some sort of like a manual type of thing that we did, and you could buy it, and they were about what they are now, about $100. Like these seat stand mats and stuff like that, they were not available. If either you had them, old ones, or you didn't have them. That was it. A lot of the door panels and all that stuff, could not buy it. They were not available. You had to find used stuff, and usually it was pretty cheap for used stuff. Used parts were actually really cheap, so it didn't matter that much. They did not make repop safaris until I think around 90s. Somebody started making them, and the original, but you could find a set of original safaris at a swap meet for about $400 back then, originals. So, you know, and the guys that were making them were selling them back then. Now think about this: in the early 90s, when they started making these by hand, they wanted $400 for a brand new set. So it was about the same price as what you pay. You know, it wasn't that much cheaper than it is now. So, and the funny thing is, a bus, let's say a bus that you'd see now for $30,000 was worth about $3,000. So if you factor that in, the people that kept them all those years and kept them through till now, and you think, wow, they don't deserve the money that they're getting for them. They absolutely do, because they sacrificed a lot back then. These rubber here were only available German. They were like $25 a piece. These were available new. I bought these. They weren't much. I think they were like about $6 German only. Everything was all German. All the bus parts was all German parts. They didn't have anything else. You could usually buy an emblem at the swap meet between 10 and $50. So that's what they were back then. But you had to buy them at the swap meet. You could not buy them new or repopped. Still, again, the hubcaps were the same as bugs, so they were like $10 a set. So that was cheap for the round ones. Back in the old days, a lot of us ran the replica Porsche nipple. The Porsche nipple was actually $20 a set, and they were like really nice. You know, $20 I think, or $10 a piece maybe. Yeah, I think it was $10, $40 a set. And they were like, they looked exactly like the original Porsche hubcaps. They were the same weight. They had the emblem said Porsche on them. You really could not tell the difference between those and the 356 Porsche hubcaps. You know, you always had trouble finding middle seats for buses, even in the 80s. They were, you know, you could find them. And usually it was somebody that had one, you know, sitting in their garage, and you usually could find one used of around $100. You know, think about that today. The front seats and stuff like that, you had to buy them used. Could not buy anything new. There was no seat covers even made for buses. You had to have them upholstered somewhere. There was no replica seat covers, not available. Even the clocks at the swap meets, they were around $100. So if you think about it, I don't know how much they go for it today. What, $250? I don't know. I've never had to buy one used, so, but they were about $100 back then. The gauges usually you could get, you know, pretty cheap. You'd probably pay $10 for a fuel gauge, or about $20 for a speedo used. Again, like I said, a lot of the parts weren't available. I remember buying the whole engine rebuild set. These gel bars were always expensive. They've always been expensive. They've never been cheap. I remember buying the whole engine kit for like $300 for 1600. You know, Klobenschmidt bearings, Klobenschmidt pistons. You know, $300. Not, you know, and then you could also buy MPR big bore kits were $109, if I remember right. $109 for MPR was the only one that made the forged pistons. So and all the big bore kits were all forged. So now today you can get a 1835 or whatever 92s, and 1835 the 92s are whatever $100, but they're not forged. They're all cast. So anything overboard stuff was always forged back in the old days. Now they're all cast, so it's not even the same quality parts. The funny thing is you could get all the bearings and everything for your engine pretty cheap. It was like then it was all real German stuff. They didn't have much of the other cheaper stuff. They did, but nobody bought it. The turn. I remember going, the early stuff that was rare is going to the swap meet on your early bus. I had a 57, and the taillights. They had the two different taillights. You had the round taillights, and then they had the bubble taillights, and both of those usually sold for around $50 to $100 a set, and that was a lot of money back then. $100 for a set of taillights was a lot. I remember buying my taillights. I bought some that were cracked on purpose. Everybody goes, "Why did you buy cracked taillights?" I go, "Because then nobody's going to steal them." So I had cracks in my 57 bus taillights, and that's why I ran it, and nobody ever stole them. And I paid, I think, $50 for the pair of those, and that included the housing, original housing, and the taillight lenses. So, another thing, brake parts. And brake parts were available for the rear. They had, I think they have a same part number as the Bugs for something like that for the rear wheel cylinders. The wheel cylinders for the rear were pretty cheap. But for the front ones, I almost had like a total meltdown when I bought my wheel cylinders for the bus. And I bought the front wheel cylinders for my 57, and they were $25 a piece for German. So it was $100 for wheel cylinders. I almost had a cow. I thought that was so expensive. Now it's like, $100 a piece for German ones. But that was, but that was a lot of money in the late 80s, early 90s. $100 on wheel cylinders. I mean, I used to do a whole brake job when I was a mechanic, and we would get all 4 wheels, done, including all the brake parts, was $159 or something like that. So $100 just for the wheel cylinders was like a ridiculous amount of money. The stuff, that you could buy then, most of it for buses, again, you'd be going to swap meets, or you go to swap meets. You could go to like yard sales. You could find the stuff at, you usually find your parts at Pick Apart. And usually it was from a friend that said, "Hey man, I saw a bus over at Pick Apart," and you could buy doors. Doors were like, for a used door, I don't think it was more than $30. And the deck lids, you could buy these things for a dime a dozen, $30. You could find them at the swap meet at the Volkswagen swap meets for like 50, no problem. But it was the guys, and the funny thing about buses is that the guys who would sell the parts weren't really doing it for the money. They did it because they loved the bus, and they were just this people that just wanted to keep them on the road, so they would get parts wherever they could, and they'd hang on to them, and then you'd see them, the same guy at the swap meet with a mountain of stuff at inner shows, which was an all indoor swap meet and car show, and they'd have 3 or 4 buildings of guys in there with buses and parts and all inside there for sale. So we weren't really into restoring them. We were just into just driving them and keeping them running, and then also cow bussing them and just ratting them, just keeping them old, or just leaving them, just making it run. You weren't trying to make it look ratty. It just did, and you just drove it, and nobody cared. That was the whole thing, and because it was like the same reason that you see this bus sitting here. That's why we had them. You could put your surfboard in there. You didn't have to worry about it being on the roof of your car, and it wouldn't get bruised going to the beach. That was the whole reason for the bus. That's what SoCal buses were all about. That's what everybody had them for. It wasn't for the money. You'd lose on buses if you bought one. So, like, my first bus that I bought was a 66 21 window, and it was basically a shell. And once I started getting into the parts part of it, trying to find the parts and everything else, I ended up selling it because it was going to cost me more in parts to put it back together than just sell it and then try and find one that was more complete. Some of the things I'll tell you while I'm on this video about buses back then is I'll tell you about some of the buses that I bought and sold. A few of them that I remember. There's several that I don't. But I remember I wanted a set of Safaris for my 57, and I really wanted a set of Safaris for it, original. And I thought the only way to go is original, and you know, because there wasn't any repops. And I found a 60. What the heck was that thing? I think it was a 64 or 63. 11 window van. It was an 11 window. It was an 11 window bus, and one of my friends of mine saw it in somebody's front yard, and he goes, "Dude, it has Safaris." I go, "No way, it's got Safaris on it?" And he goes, "Yeah, come check it out." It was sealing wax red, beige gray, and primed with a spray can over that. And I went over to the guy's house, and he goes, "Man, I think the guy will take like a pretty cheap price for it." And I go, "Really, for the whole bus?" And he goes, "Yeah, it had a bug trans in it, so the tires were rubbing. You know, back then they didn't have put bug transes in buses. You just put a bus trans in it, or you didn't drive it. They didn't have kits to change all that stuff. So the bug trans was rubbing on the arms, were just like was bolted on with one bolt, and it was rubbing on the spring plates just a little bit, and it was sitting in the guy's driveway, and he goes, and I go, "How much you want for it?" And he goes, "Well, I don't know, I want to sell it." And he goes, "I want the $200." And I'm like, "I'll give you $150." He goes, "All right." Bought the bus for $150, 11 window van. I pushed it 4 or 5 blocks when my buddy did over to my house. I took the Safaris out of it. I took the Safaris out with an air chisel out of the front, and was getting done chiseling out the things at it. And my buddy comes over and he goes, "Hey," he goes, "what are you going to do with that bus?" I go, "Well, I don't know." He goes, "You want to sell it?" And I go, "What, do you want to buy it?" And he goes, "Yeah, I'll buy it." So I go, "Well, I'll tell you what, give me $75. So I sold him the rest of the bus, 11 window van, for $75, complete, without motor and trans. The trans that was in it was just a bug. And, you know, the funny thing is, he kept that van until about 10 years ago. I didn't even know he had it still. I thought he got rid of it. And what he did is this is before anybody knew what patina was or original paint. He just took a rag and wiped off all the primer, just took lacquer thinner and a rag and wiped off all the primer and had it all down to sealing wax red and beige gray paint. And I think it even had a middle seat. No, it didn't have a middle seat. For sure it didn't have one, because I would have kept it, because I was still trying to find a middle seat. They were hard to find back then. So that was one of them. Now check this out. I mean, I sold my 21 window. I bought it for $150. The 21 window shell. Well, they were kind of pricey back then. You had to pay about $1,200 for a complete van, which was quite a bit of money. And so a 21 window. So then I I sold it. A guy came by and he goes, "Hey man, I rolled my van," and I knew the guy. I'd seen him around town, and he goes, "Yeah, I rolled it, and my roof is bad." And he goes, and I jacked it up really bad. And I go, "Wow." And he goes, "Hey, you want to sell? Why don't you sell me your bus for 150?" Or I bought it for 75, and yeah, I bought it for $75, that van, and then I sold it to him for 150. So I made $75, so I was happy. I sold him the van for $150, the 21 window, and then found my 57 combi bus that I had for many years. That had my combi bus had they were just like crap. I don't know, some kind of homemade rubber, but they had original skylight glass put in it, so it was kind of weird. And I didn't know and it also had corner windows, so they added corner windows, and there was a blank window here, and then it had the skylight glass going along the top, but it wasn't original. It wasn't grafted in metal. It was just like they put this weird rubber stuff around it that was some sort of aftermarket stuff, and I drove that because I wanted the 21 window, and that's what I want, or 21 or 23 window, and I couldn't afford one. Another bus I saw that I passed up was back then was a split window barn door, 50. I think it was a 51, and it was painted like a school bus yellow. And one of my buddies, again, I used to have people, they would scout for me. They'd find stuff back when I was younger, and I was the only one with money in my pocket. So if they saw something, they would tell me. And he came over and he goes, "Hey man," because they knew I was into buses and nobody else was. He goes, "Dude, I found a barn door." And I'm like, "What? Really? A barn door?" Dude, they were hard to find back then. They were just as hard then as they are now. In fact, you could probably find a barn door easier now with the Samba than you could back then. So, and he goes, "Dude, it has ambulance fans in it." I'm like, "What?" And back then, ambulance fans at a swap meet, they sold for $150. You guys go, "What? $150? That was a lot of money. $100 for wheel cylinders was ridiculously expensive. $150 I could buy ambulance fans." And this was on a barn door. So I go over to their house, and this thing's in their backyard. All right, this barn door bus is in their backyard, and it's got the doors open. The cargo floors are good compared to today. The outer edge was rusted. So right here, the outer edge of the cargo floor was rusted out, which to me back then was a big deal. There was maybe a little hole there or something like that. And the cargo floor was rusted out here. The rocker was rusted. This bottom part of the rocker right here was rusted out, and it had some fake metal put into it. It looked like something had sideswiped the quarter, and the back door was still on it. There was no motor in it, and it still had transaxle, was still in it, and other than that, it was pretty complete. And back then, I had the money sitting there, and the guy and my friend says, "Dude, I think we can get it. I think you can get that thing for $750." And I went, "Wow, man. Oh, dude, this thing needs a lot of work." Today I'd look at it and I'd be like, "Oh my God, that's like, I could do that whole thing in like a few hours." But back then, it was like, oh man, because the parts were so hard to find, and so you had to buy them used. And today you could buy patch panels for all that stuff. Back then you had to make it all by hand, and it was like I was looking at, oh man, dude, that's a lot of work. I wasn't even thinking about driving a patina or old, which would have been cool as hell back then even. And I was looking at it and I'm going, the dash was all there. It was all clean. Ambulance fans in it. It had that, I don't know what it's called, in the front, the little thing up here, the little snorkel thing on the roof. It looked like it was made out of plastic or fiberglass, and I thought, what the hell's that? There was so few barn doors around back then that we didn't even know what that stuff was. And I was looking at the dash and going, man, that's really cool. And man, I don't know, I just didn't I didn't move on it. I looked at it and I went, nah, that just looks like too much work. You know, the doors have, you know, all you had a little bit of rust at the bottom. We thought that was a big deal back then. You know, if it had a little rust at the bottom of the door, I could go to swap. You go down and the pick apart, you could just go find another one. You wouldn't bother trying to fix it or weld it up. Nowadays, you're cutting and welding everything. But yeah, there's, you know, that's I took so many of these things to the junkyard. You know, it's not even funny, you know, or just, you know, people were just driving them and living in them too and stuff like that. You know, hippies I knew, and nobody really cared. You know, it was not a big. There's a lot of guys who really cared about keeping one, you know, or saving one. And you know, the motor burned up, you just left it on the side of the road, and that was it. You know, who cared? Back then, they just weren't worth enough money. Like a combi bus wasn't worth enough to even save it. You know, if the motor went out or something happened to it, you got in a little wreck, it was like gone. You just let it go because they just weren't worth anything. You know, back in the 80s. And then they became popular because all the surfers had them and everybody wanted to be a cool surfer, and you know, so they started buying them up. And then in the late 90s they started getting real, you know, people started patina riding them and lowering them and stuff like that. And I wasn't even into them. I still had my bus, but I wasn't really following that crowd. So anyway, that's just a little bit about how the bus parts were back then. There wasn't anything new. It was all used. You had to piece it all together. But anyway, I just thought I'd bring that out there for you guys who are looking. You know, people were really interested in the bug prices back then. You could buy all the stuff new for a bug, but for buses, it was West Coast Metrics or Wolfsburg West came out later in the early 90s. And I actually went there back in the early 90s. BFY was around. They had all the, you know, I guess it was Rich Kimball's company. I didn't hardly know Rich. I used to see him in there, but I didn't know him. And they used to have, I bought stuff there because they had, you know, NOS original stuff. Like I bought fender beating for my bug, like the original stuff, because I wanted the ivory colored ones, and you couldn't buy them other than the original. It was only black. Also, you could buy aftermarket fender beating was all black. So I wanted the white ones, so I bought them over there. So, but BFY's around, and they sold stuff, but man, it was high dollar, expensive for buses. It was always really, really expensive, and like I said, if it broke down, people would just get rid of them. They didn't care. You know, it was worthless. And you know, because what are you gonna like a 66? My friend bought a 66. 6621 window, and bought it as a driver, paid $3,300, you know, original paint, original patina, unrestored and in perfect shape. I mean, all the interior was all original, and all the trim was on it. And all the seat covers weren't ripped or anything. It was in pretty good shape for $3,300, and that was the going rate. And that was because it was a 21 window. If it wasn't a 21 window, if it was anything else, 11 window, combi, that nobody cared. It was just like, throw it away. Who cares? Anyway, that was the way it went. All right, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe.